Nigeria should be one of the richest countries on earth. It has vast oil reserves, a massive population, one of the largest economies in Africa. For years, it looked like the continent's future superpower. But today, that picture looks very different. The currency is in freefall. Inflation has hit crisis levels. Millions can't afford to eat. This wasn't caused by war or a natural disaster. It was self-inflicted. Because Nigeria didn't just stumble into this. It built a system that scammed itself into collapse. In 2025, Nigeria sat as Africa's fourth largest economy, behind South Africa, Egypt, and Algeria. Not long ago, it was number one. The fall from that position wasn't the result of a single disaster or just one corrupt leader. It was the result of something much harder to fix. A system that learned the wrong lessons from its own wealth and then kept teaching them to itself for decades. To understand how that happened, we have to start with what Nigeria actually was, because the potential was real. Africa's most populous nation, over 240 million people, a young, rapidly growing population that should have been an economic engine, a coastline on the Atlantic, access to major trade routes, a telecommunications revolution in the early 2000s that added over 1 million mobile subscribers within its first year alone. And then there was the oil. More on that in a moment. From 2000 to 2014, Nigeria's economy grew at roughly 7% per year. That's not a developing world consolation prize. That's genuinely impressive growth. The consulting firm PwC projected Nigeria could become one of the world's top 10 economies by mid-century. The giant of Africa wasn't just a nickname that Nigerians gave themselves, it was the label that the rest of the world was beginning to use too. In 2014, Nigeria recalculated how it measured its own economy, updating its statistical base year to reflect the explosion of sectors like telecommunications and entertainment that hadn't been properly counted before. Overnight, Nigeria was crowned Africa's largest economy. The numbers seemed to confirm everything that the optimists had been saying. But there was something revealing about the moment, not the milestone itself, but how it happened. Nigeria didn't become Africa's largest economy because it had built more factories, or educated more workers, or solved its power problem, or cracked down on corruption. It became Africa's largest economy because it changed the spreadsheet. The underlying reality didn't change, only the measurement did. And if you squint at that story hard enough, you can already see the shape of everything that followed. A country that got very good at looking better on paper than it felt on the ground. But underneath that headline, a contradiction had been building for decades. Oil wasn't even Nigeria's largest sector. Agriculture and services were bigger. And yet oil accounted for over 90% of the country's foreign exchange earnings and roughly 60% of government revenue. The economy was diversified in theory. The state was not. And that distinction would prove catastrophic. So how does a country with all of that end up here? Well, it starts with the oil, and with the particular problem of getting too rich too fast from the wrong thing. Nigeria struck oil in 1956, just 4 years before independence. By 1958, the first fields were producing. By 1971, Nigeria had joined OPEC. And by 1988, petroleum accounted for 87% of the country's export receipts and 77% of federal government revenue. This wasn't a slow drift into oil dependency, it was a sprint. Here's the core problem with that. When a government funds itself from resource rents instead of taxes, something changes in how it operates. A government that lives on taxes needs to build things: roads, courts, schools, services, because those are the conditions under which people and businesses generate the taxable income that the state depends on. A government that lives on oil revenue doesn't need citizens in the same way. It needs the oil to keep flowing. That shift in incentives doesn't happen overnight. It's subtle. It shows up in hiring decisions, in contract awards, in which politicians get promoted and which ones get sidelined. Slowly, the state stops being a machine that serves its population and starts becoming a machine for distributing rents to whoever holds power. Nigeria didn't invent this pattern. Economists call it the resource curse, but it fell into it with a completeness that's difficult to overstate. And there's a particular cruelty embedded in how this plays out, because oil wealth isn't evenly distributed across a country's geography. It pools in specific regions, flows through specific pipelines, and lands in specific government accounts. In Nigeria, the oil came from the Niger Delta, a region that by the 2000s had become one of the most environmentally devastated places on Earth. where local communities saw almost none of the wealth extracted from beneath their land while living surrounded by oil spills and gas flares. The communities that created Nigeria's wealth became some of Nigeria's most neglected people, and the resentment that built from that neglect fed decades of armed militancy, pipeline sabotage, and instability, which, ironically, made the oil production even less reliable, which made the revenue even more volatile, and which made the state even more desperate. A loop that never closed. Easy money doesn't just change what you spend. It changes what you think you need to do to survive. And once that thinking takes hold inside the institutions, the military, civil service, the political class, it spreads. Because the oil era didn't just reward the wrong behavior, it normalized it. Nigeria went through 6 successful coups between 1966 and 1993. 6. Each one was led by officers who claimed that they were restoring order, but each one made the problem worse. Military rule became the context inside which Nigeria's oil boom played out, and military governments, it turned out, were exceptionally good at extraction and exceptionally bad at institution building. The most notorious example is Sani Abacha, who ruled Nigeria from 1993 to 1998. During his 5 years in power, Abacha is estimated to have looted between $3 and $5 billion in public funds, cash pulled directly from the central bank under the cover of national security authorizations, and then washed through shell companies and parked in bank accounts across Switzerland, the UK, the United States, and Liechtenstein. Successive Nigerian governments have spent decades since trying to recover it. By 2026, total confirmed recoveries cited by Nigerian federal court have reached roughly $5 billion. Switzerland demanded World Bank oversight before agreeing to return one tranche, an agreement so unusual that it tells you everything about how deeply the credibility of Nigerian institutions had been damaged. But here's the thing. Abacha is remembered as the villain, as the extreme case, and that framing is actually part of the problem. Because by treating Abacha as the exception, he made it easier to treat the decades of institutionalized extraction around him as normal. He wasn't the system breaking down. He was the system operating as designed. And once that kind of system takes hold, it doesn't just stay in politics. Because here's the part that nobody talks about. The corruption didn't corrupt the economy in isolation. It corrupted how Nigerians understood the economy itself. When the system rewards extraction over production. When political connections matter more than hard work. When the path to wealth runs through access to the government rather than through building something. People notice. They adapt. They start operating by the rules as they actually exist, not the rules as they were supposed to exist. This is the context in which Nigeria's reputation for fraud emerged, not as a separate story, but as a symptom of the same disease. 419. The term comes directly from Section 419 of the Nigerian Criminal Code, the advance-free fraud provision. The schemes became prominent in the 1980s, right as oil prices collapsed and economic desperation began to spike. You know the format. A prince, an inheritance, an oil deal, a request for a small upfront payment to unlock a much larger reward. The same logic scaled to millions of people with email addresses and a broken economy behind them. Globally, the Nigerian scam became a punchline. Inside Nigeria, it became something much more damaging. A reputation that attached itself to every legitimate Nigerian business, entrepreneur, and professional operating abroad. Researchers estimated losses from these schemes at over $3 billion in 2005 alone. And that figure doesn't count the cost of the reputation itself, which is harder to quantify and impossible to quickly undo. Foreign investors started treating Nigeria as a default risk. Partnerships came with extra scrutiny. Businesses paid what economists call a credibility tax just for being Nigeria. There's a bitter irony in this. Nigeria's mobile connectivity, the same revolution that had driven 7% annual growth in the early 2000s, also turned out to be the infrastructure on which fraud scaled globally. The tools of economic development and the tools of reputation destruction ran on the same network. And the state that could have built the counter-narrative, that could have cracked down hard, that could have demonstrated that Nigeria was serious about the rule of law, didn't. Because the same institutional weakness that let corruption thrive in government let the fraud ecosystem thrive unchecked. And the FDI that should have been flooding into the country of more than 240 million people with vast natural resources didn't. Nigeria's foreign direct investment had collapsed to just 29.83 million in a single quarter by 2024. That's not a number, that's a signal. Hey, if you're following this breakdown and you want more of the stories behind the headlines, subscribe to Fall of Nations, because what comes next is where the numbers get brutal. What the fraud story and the corruption story share is a common foundation, a system that had hollowed itself out. And by the 2010s, that hollowing was showing up in the real economy in ways that were no longer abstract. Nigeria's industrial share of GDP fell from 27.65% in 2014 to 21.08% by 2024. In 2023 alone, 767 Nigerian factories closed, and another 335 were reported to be in serious distress. The reason wasn't primarily international competition, it was the basic cost of operating in Nigeria. Power cuts were so chronic that generators weren't a backup plan. They were an operating expense baked into every budget. Logistics were unreliable. Policy changed without warning. And the currency? Well, we'll get to the currency. Think about what that means concretely. A factory owner in Lagos isn't competing against a Chinese rival because Chinese goods are cheaper. They're competing against a domestic environment that makes production nearly impossible. They're paying for diesel to run a generator because the national grid delivers power for a few hours a day, if at all. They're paying import costs on raw materials because local supply chains never developed. They're navigating a foreign exchange system that, for years, made it nearly impossible to get the dollars needed to import the inputs to make the things that they were trying to sell. This is what a hollowed economy looks like from the inside. It's not a dramatic crash, but a slow, grinding, expensive impossibility. Agriculture tells a similar story. Nigeria's farms produce large volumes, but at some of the lowest yields per acre in the world. Not because of bad soil or bad climate, but because of limited access to fertilizer, mechanized tools, and functioning supply chains. More land, more hands, but not more productivity. What makes this particularly damaging is that agriculture employs the majority of Nigeria's workforce. When agriculture productivity stagnates, it doesn't just affect the farming sector. It keeps wages depressed across the entire labor market. It constrains domestic demand and feeds the cycle of underemployment that makes young men vulnerable to recruitment by armed groups. An economy growing on paper while the fundamentals rot. And then the oil price crashed. Between mid-2014 and early 2016, global oil prices dropped by approximately 70%. For a country where oil accounted for 90% of foreign exchange earnings, the hit was immediate and violent. Nigeria entered its first recession in 25 years in 2016. The Naira came under pressure. Foreign reserves drained. Businesses that relied on imported inputs, which were most businesses, given the collapsed manufacturing sector, found themselves unable to source the foreign currency they needed. The government introduced a recovery plan. Corruption gutted its implementation. The economy partially stabilized, and then COVID arrived in 2020, triggering Nigeria's second recession in 5 years. Then Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, spiking global energy prices. But Nigeria, which had to import refined petroleum products because its own state refineries had been offline for years, couldn't capture the windfall. Africa's largest oil producer was paying to import the fuel that its own population needed to run generators because the state had never built a functioning refinery system. I ought to read that twice. Again, Africa's largest oil producer paying to import fuel that its own population needed to run generators. And then came May 2023. Bola Tinubu took office and immediately launched the most radical economic reforms that Nigeria had seen in decades. In his inauguration speech, he announced that the fuel subsidy was gone. The subsidy that had been costing the government roughly $9.7 billion in 2022, equivalent to 2.3% of GDP, to keep petrol prices artificially low for ordinary Nigerians, was removed. Now, its removal was necessary. The IMF had been demanding it for years. Even many Nigerian economists agreed that it was unsustainable. But the way that it was done, overnight with no transition, no cushion, no compensation mechanism for the poor, meant that petrol prices jumped by more than 200% in a single day. And a country where fuel powers every generator, every truck, every supply chain, well, they felt that price shock through everything. And that wasn't even the biggest hit. On June 14th of 2023, the Central Bank of Nigeria removed the currency controls that had kept the naira pegged to the dollar at an artificially high rate for years. The logic was sound. The peg had created a parallel black market, encouraged corruption, and made Nigeria unattractive to foreign investors. The execution was devastating. The naira dropped 36% in a single day. By the end of 2025, the currency had lost roughly 70% of its value since the moment that Tinubu took office, falling from about 460 naira to the dollar to nearly 1,500. A currency that had taken decades of mismanagement to weaken was dismantled in months. Nigeria's inflation averaged 31% across 2024. Food inflation hit 40% at its peak. For a country where the average urban household was already stretched, where labor incomes had been stagnating for years, this wasn't just an inconvenience. This was a catastrophe. The government was simultaneously spending between 68% and 96% of its collected revenue just to service existing debt. Not build hospitals, not fund schools, not maintain roads, servicing debt. The structural reforms that should have freed up investment capital instead triggered an inflation spiral that wiped out whatever purchasing power that ordinary Nigerians had left. This is what a self-reinforcing collapse looks like. Corruption weakens institutions. Weak institutions can't diversify the economy. A microeconomy can't absorb shocks. Shocks require desperate reforms. And desperate reforms, implemented without the trust infrastructure that makes them work, detonate inside an already fragile system. And the poor pay the price. By 2025, the World Bank projected that over 61% of Nigerians were living in poverty. That's 139 million people. An additional 42 million fell into poverty after 2018 alone. The combined weight of COVID, the currency collapse, the subsidy removal, and the inflation that followed each shock. In August of 2024, Nigerians took to the streets in what became known as the End Bad Governance protests. Demonstrations spread across the country. Security forces responded with live ammunition in several cities. People died. The government acknowledged the pain and urged dialogue, but it didn't reverse any of the reforms. It didn't address the corruption. It didn't offer any credible mechanism for ensuring the savings from subsidy removal would reach the people who needed them. What was striking about those protests was not just the anger. It was the specific shape of that anger. Demonstrators weren't arguing that fuel subsidies should have been removed. Many understood the fiscal logic. What they were furious about was the spectacle of a political class that had spent decades looting the state, now asking ordinary Nigerians to absorb the pain of fixing it. While budget padding scandals circulated, while officials collected fleets of SUVs, while reports of a presidential yacht surfaced. The math of austerity is tolerable when people believe the sacrifice is shared. It becomes explosive when they believe that the savings will simply be relooted. And in Nigeria, after everything, why would anyone believe anything else? That's the final piece of the collapse logic, and the most important one. It's not just that Nigeria's institutions were corrupt. It's that they were corrupt for so long that the public stopped believing that reform was possible. And when people stop believing that reform is possible, even the right reforms become impossible to implement. Because every difficult policy looks like another scam, another extraction, another promise that will be looted before it reaches them. The IMF backed subsidy removal. The World Bank backed currency unification. Both were the correct medicine for a sick economy. But correct medicine administered by doctors the patient no longer trusts doesn't work the way it should. ODI's analysis of the subsidy reform put it plainly. Successful reforms require rebuilding public trust and demonstrating that savings will be reallocated transparently. Nigeria had spent decades ensuring that no such trust existed. Nigeria didn't run out of wealth. It built a system where wealth could not turn into stability, where every injection of resources became an opportunity for extraction, where the institutions that should have converted oil into hospitals, roads, and industries instead converted it into Swiss bank accounts and campaign funds and private jets while the population went hungry. In 2026, Nigeria remains one of the most consequential countries on Earth. 240 million people, a young population, enormous untapped potential. The question isn't whether it has the ingredients to recover. It clearly does. The question is whether a system this thoroughly broken can reform itself before the next generation inherits the wreckage. Because the scam isn't over. The same incentive structures that created the problem are still in place. The same political economy that rewarded extraction over production is still running. And as long as that's true, every new barrel of oil, every new reform package, every new government promising change is just another round in the same long con. So what would it actually take to break the cycle? Is there a version of this story where Nigeria does turn it around? Well, let us know what you think in the comments, and subscribe to Fall of Nations, because we're not done covering the countries the world forgot to watch.